we celebrate this gospel on the fifth Sunday of Lent, and it always, the story of Lazarus always reminds me of my father and his death, which was on right around the fifth Sunday of Lent, okay? And even back in the day, even though the scriptures, well, much of the Mass and everything was in Latin, but the scriptures, of course, were all in English. So it always takes me back to that time with my father. And I'll just tell you, I might have mentioned this before. So I was in the fifth grade this time of year and came home from school one day, and we went to St. Mary's in Illyria, and my brother was coming out of the house kind of all frazzled, and I didn't know what that meant. But he said, "Dad died." I said, "Dad died?" He said, "Yes, your father died." I said, so, now at the time, honestly, I had never, ever thought about people dying. It never happened. I mean, I had never had that experience with any relatives or friends or anyone else. And so it was kind of like just beyond my conception, first of all, that my father could have died, but second of all, that for that matter, that anyone died, because I just never been there before. So I got there in a real hurry, believe me, and it just, was just a very sad day. My dad was the postmaster in Illyria, and, that was a big event when the postmaster or any other kind of political figure, because it was, even though it was a political figure, not active necessarily, but it was, in a political appointment for sure. So, he just got the job, and he was good at it, and we were doing very, very well as a family. My mother was born in Ireland, came to the United States. She was a housewife. She never really worked. She never drove. She didn't do anything. And now my father is dead, and even as a kid, I knew some things were going to change, okay? And there was no doubt about that. But so I was like in such a state of shock. So because it was a major figure that had died, in those days, and some of you have been around for a while might remember this, I mean, they had like a 3 or 4, I think it was a 3-day wake for my father, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and the funeral was on Thursday. So, but it was a full 3 days, and it was like, at that point in time, probably the worst experience of my life. I mean, I'd never sat through a funeral. I never dreamed of that. I never thought of that. It never entered my head that I would have to go through that. And of course, people were coming up to me and my brother, and mostly my mother, but expressing their condolences and sorrow. So it was just, and I just, through all of that, I was never really able to cry. I just never did. It probably would have been a good thing to do, but I was like stunned. To tell you the truth, that's exactly what I was, stunned, and I just never got to crying. It just never happened, although I think it would have helped, but it just didn't happen. So, but then I think of, later on, and so I was kind of angry with God. It really changed my family around a lot. We had to sell the house we were in because we couldn't afford it. My mother had to go to work. My mother had to buy a car. She had to learn to drive. She had to learn to do lots of things. So, and she did. She figured it out. I give her credit to this day and probably to the last day of my life until I catch up with her again. I mean, all the credit goes to her because she knew the burden she had with 2 sons and, limited income, and she did what she had to do. And honestly, she really did it very, very well. And I'm very proud of what she was able to accomplish and the example and the witness she was for me. But my dad, as I thought back on it later on, he was really a good man. No doubt about that. He was a good person. In his earlier life, he had some drinking problems, and there was some kind of confrontation between himself and my mother, and he quit drinking. Just quit drinking on the spot. I don't even know if they had AA in the 50s, but he quit drinking, and that was a good thing he did, and things kind of were very normal in the family, that period of time that he was still alive after he quit drinking. So, but he was just a good example and a good witness and a good, I guess, say, role model for me. One time when I was younger and in school, I don't know, something happened and the principal called. Now, not that I was a bad kid, but I probably wasn't the best kid in the class either, but the principal called, so my dad asked me something and I told him a lie, and he said, look, I know the story, I know you're lying. From now on, I don't want you to lie to me anymore. Lying is not acceptable, don't lie. So honestly, from that time on, I've probably never told a lie. I never, because, he kind of read that to me very clearly. This is not something you do, it's not right, so I didn't do it anymore. And there was really, and it works much better when you tell the truth. I found that out at that early age, believe me, I really did. So, and my dad, he did not go to church. He didn't. He would not, I don't know why he wouldn't go. Did he come to my first communion? I'd like to think he did, but I don't know. I mean, I can't remember. But what he did do is, we had a Monsignor in our parish who was a scripture scholar in the diocese, Monsignor Newton, and Newton was like a very intelligent guy, okay? So he called my father and asked if my brother and I could serve Mass in church on Sunday at the 7 a.m. Mass, okay? And every Sunday they had a 7 a.m. Mass. Every Sunday at 7 a.m., Walt and George Jenny were there to serve, okay? For years, even after he died, we were there to serve because, you know why? He said we would. If he said we would, and we did. So that's the way it was. He just went with the program, and I never took on the program. So one day, I know I mentioned this before, Monsignor said to me after Mass, so I'm in the 4th grade, all right? He said to me after Mass one day, he said, young man, why don't you invite your father to come to Mass? I said, I didn't know what to say, but I did say, Monsignor, why don't you? What, And I really meant that. It was shaky ground for me to get into. I wasn't going to get into it. And then one day after Mass, Monsignor came out, because my dad would go to his delicatessen, he would get some cigarettes, he'd get a newspaper, and he'd get some coffee. That's what he would do, okay? And that was pretty normal in that day and age. And he was waiting in the parking lot for us, and Monsignor came out and said, and I heard this, so I can't make it up. He said, William, I understand your boys are learning to drive at the YMCA. The Catholic Church doesn't approve of the YMCA. And my dad said to Monsignor, and these are exactly the words he said, Monsignor, when you build a pool and open it, they'll come to your pool. But until you build a pool, they're going to learn to swim, okay? And Monsignor walked away. That was the end of the conversation. But any time, ordinarily, that Monsignor would call, like we used to serve, there were Vespers, I think in just about all the churches in the 50s, at like 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, we'd be out playing somewhere, particularly in the snow, sled riding, because we had a yard that went right down to the river, and we'd be out doing that. My dad would call Monsignor and say, I need servers for Vespers at 3 o'clock. He would come to the house, he would get us, we'd be soaking wet, he'd haul us off to church, we'd do what we did, help at whatever we were doing, and then he'd pick us up and bring us right back to the hill where he picked us up from. So my point of telling you that he always was just a very stand-up guy and just a wonderful role model and example for me going forward. And if there was anything that I will always feel bad about was I didn't have the opportunity to have more time with him. You know, he was a mechanic by trade. I'm sure he could have taught me a lot, but just never had the opportunity because, you know, of the fact that he passed away. But, you know, it was just this day of Lazarus and rising from the dead just always reminds me of that. And I have no doubt but that my father's in heaven. He had a sister and a brother. It's interesting. And, you know, I didn't ask any questions because I was smarter than that, okay? I really was. And the sister was very, very Catholic, you know, very prayerful, very Catholic. My dad and his brother, not so much. And I don't know if it was the difference in the family, in the way they were raised, or what was going on. I mean, but there's a story there, and I never felt comfortable asking the story. I just didn't need to know it, I figured. So I didn't. But, you know, but he was a great example. And, you know, today we celebrate Lazarus and Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So it's just a good reminder to me that Lazarus was raised from the dead, and he certainly went to heaven. My dad, I really believe that he is up in heaven because he truly was just a genuinely good person. No doubt about that. No question about my mother at all. Not even debatable. She's up there. So one day my goal is I hope to catch up with them in the kingdom, okay? And that should be a hope that all of us hold in our hearts for all of our loved ones who have died because of Jesus, because of his death, but because of his resurrection, that one day we'll catch up with all those folks again in the kingdom. And sometimes, final thing I'll say, sometimes at this point in my life, sometimes I think, I don't know how far off this is, but it's ways, I'm sure, sometimes I think I know more dead people than alive people, okay? Sounds crazy, but if you think about it yourself, when you think about I used to take great comfort after my dad died because I worried that something would happen to my mother. She got sick once and ended up in the hospital. And I was always afraid that my brother and I would end up at Parmadale or somewhere because I don't know where else we would have ended up. But thank God she survived. But, faith is what it's all about, friends. And all those folks who've gone before us and paved the way for us, I believe they're with the Lord in glory, and I believe that one day you and I are going to catch up with them again. Amen.